Life of Mine Part 30. From the town we went straight to Baden-Baden. Here I abandoned Minna and her friend to the seductions of the roulette table, while I availed myself of a letter of introduction from Count Portales to Countess Hack, a lady-in-waiting on Her Royal Highness, through whom I hoped to be presented to her exalted patroness. After a little delay, I duly received an invitation to meet her in the Trink Hall at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a wet, cold day, and at that hour the whole surroundings of the place seemed absolutely devoid of life as I approached my momentous rendezvous. I found Augusta pacing to and fro with Countess Hack, and as I approached, she graciously stopped. Her conversation consisted almost entirely of assurances that she was completely powerless in every respect, in response to which I imprudently cited the hint received from the King of Saxony that I should offer her my personal thanks for previous intervention on my behalf. This she seemed evidently to resent, and dismissed me with an air of indifference meant to show that she took very little interest in my concerns. My old friend Alwine Ferman told me later that she did not know what there was about me that displeased the princess, but thought it might possibly be my Saxon accent. This time I left the much-praised paradise of Baden without carrying away any very friendly impression, and at Mannheim boarded a steamer, accompanied only by Minna, on which for the first time I was borne along the famous Rhine. It struck me as very strange that I should so often have crossed the Rhine without having once made the acquaintance of this most characteristic historical thoroughfare of medieval Germany. A hasty return to Cologne concluded this excursion, which had lasted only a week, and from which I returned to face once more the solution of the problems of my Parisian enterprise, now opening out painfully before me. One factor which seemed likely greatly to relieve the difficulties confronting me was to be found in the friendly relationship into which the young banker, Emil Erlanger, was pleased to enter towards me. This I owed, in the first place, to an extraordinary man named Albert Beckmann, a former Hanoverian revolutionary, and afterwards private librarian to Louis Napoleon, who was at this time a press agent for several interests, respecting which I was never quite clear. This man succeeded in making my acquaintance as an open admirer, in which capacity he showed himself remarkably obliging. He now informed me that M. Erlanger, by whom he was also employed in connection with the press, would be pleased to know me. I was on the point of bluntly declining the honor, saying that I wanted to know nothing about any banker except with regard to his money, when he answered my jest by telling me in all seriousness that it was precisely in this way that M. Erlanger desired to serve me. As a result of this invitation, I made the acquaintance of a genuinely agreeable man, who, having often heard my music in Germany, had become inspired by a sympathetic interest in my person. He frankly expressed a desire that I should commit the management of my financial business entirely to his hands, which meant, in fact, nothing less than that he would permanently hold himself responsible for any needful subsidies, in return for which I was to assign to him all the eventual proceeds of my Paris undertakings. This offer was distinctly novel, and moreover exactly fell in with the needs of my peculiar situation. And, in fact, so far as my subsequent financial security was concerned, I had no further difficulties to encounter until my position in Paris was fully decided. And although my later intercourse with M. Erlanger was accompanied by many circumstances which no man's kindly courtesy could have relieved, yet I ever found in him a truly devoted friend, who earnestly studied both my own personal welfare and the success of my enterprises. This eminently satisfactory turn of events was calculated to inspire me with high courage had the circumstances been somewhat different. As it was, it had no power to excite in me even the slightest enthusiasm for an undertaking of which the hollowness and unsuitability for me personally were clearly revealed every time I approached it. It was with a feeling of ill humor that I met every demand made by this venture, and yet it represented the foundation of the confidence reposed in me. My mind was subjected, however, to a certain refreshing uncertainty as to the character of my scheme by a new acquaintance who was introduced to me in connection with it. Royer informed me that he could not pass the translation which I had taken infinite pains to conjure into existence through the two men who had volunteered to help me. He most earnestly recommended a thorough revision by M. Charles Troinet, whose pseudonym was Neuter. This man was still young and extraordinarily attractive, with something friendly and open in his manner. He had called on me a few months ago to offer his cooperation in the translation of my operas, on the introduction of Olivier, his colleague at the Paris bar. Proud of my connection with Lindau, however, I had refused his help, but the time had now come when, in consequence of M. Royer's strictures, Troinet's renewed offer of his services had to be taken into consideration. He understood no German, but maintained that as far as this was concerned, he could place sufficient reliance upon his old father, who had traveled for a long time in Germany and had acquired the essentials of our language. As a matter of fact, there was no need for special knowledge in this respect, as the sole problem seemed to be to make the French verses less stiff and stilted, which poor Roche had constructed under the shameful control of Lindau, who used to make out that he knew everything better than anyone else. The inexhaustible patience with which Troinet proceeded from one change to another in order to satisfy my requirements, even with regard to the musical fitness of the version, won my sympathy for this last collaborator. From this time forward, we had to keep Lindau away from the slightest interference in this new modeling of the book. He had been recognized as quite incompetent. Roche, on the other hand, was retained, in so far as his work served as a basis for the new versification. As it was difficult for him to leave his custom office, he was excused from troubling about the remaining part of the work, as Troinet was quite free and could keep in daily touch with me. I now saw that Troinet's law degree was merely ornamental, and that he never had any thought of conducting a case. His chief interests lay in the administration of the Grand Opera, to which he was attached as keeper of the archives. First with one collaborator and then with another, he had also worked at little plays for the vaudeville and theaters of a lower order, and even for the Bouffes Parisiens. But he was ashamed of these productions and always knew how to evade talking about this sphere of activity. I was greatly obliged to him for the final arrangement of a text to my Tannhauser which could be sung, and which was regarded on all sides as acceptable. But I cannot remember ever having been attracted by anything poetic or even aesthetic in his nature. His value, however, as an experienced, warm-hearted, staunchly devoted friend at all times, especially in periods of the greatest distress, made itself more and more clearly felt. I can hardly remember ever meeting a man of such sound judgment on the most difficult points, or one so actively ready when occasion arose to uphold the view I advocated. We had first of all to join forces in promoting an entirely new piece of work. In obedience to a need I had always felt, I had seized the occasion of this carefully prepared production of Tannhauser to expand and considerably fill out the first Venus scene. For this purpose I wrote the text in loosely constructed German verses, so as to leave the translator quite free to work them out in a suitable French form. People told me that Trunet's verses were not at all bad, and with these as a basis, I composed the extra music for the scene, and only fitted a German text to it afterwards. My annoying discussions with the management on the subject of a big ballet had determined me to make extensive additions to the scene of the Venusberg. I thought that this would give the staff of the ballet a choreographic task of so magnificent a character that there would no longer be any occasion to grumble at me for my obstinacy in this matter. The musical composition of the two scenes occupied most of my time during the month of September, and at the same time I began the pianoforte rehearsals of Tannhauser in the foyer of the Grand Opera. The company, part of which had been freshly engaged for this purpose, were now assembled, and I was interested in learning the way in which a new work is studied at the French opera. The characteristic features of the system in Paris may be described simply as extreme frigidity and extraordinary accuracy. M. Vothrodt, the chorus master, excelled in both these qualities. He was a man whom I could not help regarding as hostile to me, because I had never been able to win from him a single expression of enthusiasm. On the other hand, he proved to me by the most punctilious solicitude how conscientious he really was about his work. He insisted on considerable alterations in the text, so as to obtain a favorable medium for singing. My knowledge of the scores of Aubert and Boieldieu had misled me into assuming that the French people were entirely indifferent as to whether the mute syllables in poetry and singing were to be sounded or not. Vothrodt maintained that this was only the case with composers, but not with good singers. He was always feeling misgivings about the length of my work, which I met with the observation that I could not understand how he could be afraid of boring the public with any opera after they had been accustomed to find pleasure in Rossini's Semiramis, which was often produced. Upon this he paused to reflect, and agreed with me so far as the monotony of action and of music in that work was concerned. He told me not to forget, however, that the public neither cared for action nor music, but that their whole attention was directed to the brilliancy of the singers. Tannhauser gave little scope for brilliancy, and, as a matter of fact, I had none of that quality at my disposal. The only singer in my company who had any claim to such a distinction was Madame Tedesco, a rather grotesque but voluptuous type of Jewess who had returned from Portugal and Spain after having had great triumphs in Italian operas. She did not conceal her satisfaction at having secured an engagement at the Paris Opera through my unwilling choice of her for the part of Venus. She gave herself no end of trouble to solve the problem to the best of her ability, a problem which was entirely beyond her and which was suited only to a genuine tragedy actress. For a certain time her efforts appeared to be crowned with success, and several special rehearsals with Niemann led to a lively affinity between Tannhauser and Venus. As Niemann mastered the French pronunciation with considerable skill, these rehearsals, in which Fräulein Sachs also proved delightful, made genuine and encouraging progress. Up to this point these rehearsals were undisturbed, as my acquaintance with them, Dietz, was as yet very slight. According to the rules of the opera house, Dietz had hitherto only been present at the pianoforte rehearsals as chef d'orchestre and future conductor of the opera, so as to make himself accurately acquainted with the intentions of the singers. Still less was I disturbed by M. Corman, the stage manager, who was also present at the rehearsals, and with a lively skill, characteristic of the French people, conducted the numerous so-called property rehearsals, at which the way each scene was to be played was determined. Even when M. Corman or others did not understand me, they were always ready to subordinate themselves to my decisions, for I continued to be regarded as all-powerful, and everybody thought that I could enforce what I wanted through Princess Metternich, a belief which, indeed, was not without foundation. For instance, I had learned that Prince Poniatowski was threatening to place a serious obstacle in the way of continuing our rehearsals by reviving one of his own operas, the production of which had fallen through. The undaunted princess met my complaints on this subject by obtaining an immediate order that the prince's opera should be laid aside. Naturally, this did not tend to ingratiate me with the prince, and he did not fail to make me feel his displeasure when I called upon him. In the midst of all this work, I was afforded some recreation by a visit from my sister Louise with part of her family. To entertain her in my own home presented the greatest difficulties owing to the strange fact that it was now becoming absolutely dangerous to approach my house. When I first took it, the proprietor gave me a fairly long lease, but would not undertake any repairs. I now discovered the reason of this was that it had just been decided by the Paris Committee of Reconstruction to clear the Rue Newton with all its side streets to facilitate the opening up of a broad boulevard from one of the bridges to the Barrière de la Toile. But up to the last moment this plan was officially denied, so as to avoid for as long as possible the liability of paying compensation for the land that was to be expropriated. To my astonishment, I noticed that excavations were being made close to my front door. These increased in width, so that at first no carriages could pass my door, and finally my house was unapproachable even on foot. Under these circumstances, the proprietor had no objection to make to my leaving the house. His sole stipulation was that I should sue him for damages, as that was the only way by which he in his turn could sue the government. About this time my friend Olivier was debarred for 3 months on account of a parliamentary misdemeanor. He therefore recommended me for the conduct of my case to his friend Picard, who, as I saw later on from the legal proceedings, acquitted himself of his task with much humor. Nevertheless, there was no chance of damages for me. Whether the proprietor obtained any, I cannot say, but at all events, I had to content myself with being released from my agreement. I also obtained leave to look about for another house, and instituted my search in a neighborhood less remote from the opera. I found a poor, cheerless spot in the Rue d'Aumale. Late in the autumn and stormy weather we completed the arduous task of moving, in which Louise's daughter, my niece Ottilie, proved a capable and willing child. Unfortunately, I caught a violent cold in the course of moving and took few precautions to check it. I again exposed myself to the growing excitement of the rehearsals, and eventually I was struck down by typhoid fever. We had reached the month of November. My relations had to go home, leaving me behind in a state of unconsciousness, in which I was consigned to the care of my friend Gasparini. In my fits of fever, I insisted on their calling in all imaginable medical aid, and, as a matter of fact, Count Hatzfeld did bring in the doctor attached to the Prussian embassy. The injustice thus done to my friend, who took the greatest care of me, was due to no mistrust of him, but to feverish hallucinations which filled my brain with the most outrageous and luxuriant fancies. In this condition, not only did I imagine that Princess Metternich and Madame Kalergis were arranging a complete court for me, to which I invited the Emperor Napoleon, but I actually requested that Emile Erlanger should place a villa near Paris at my disposal, and that I should be removed to it, as it was impossible for me to recover in the dark hole where I was. At last I insisted on being taken to Naples, where I promised myself a speedy recovery in free intercourse with Garibaldi. Gasparini held bravely out against all this madness, and he and Minna had to use force in order to apply the necessary mustard plasters to the soles of my feet. During bad nights later on in life, similar vain and extravagant fancies used to return to me, and on waking I have realized with horror that they were the offspring of that period of fever. After 5 days we mastered the fever, but I seemed to be threatened with blindness, and my weakness was extreme. At last the injury to my sight passed away, and after a few weeks I again trusted myself to steal along the few streets between my house and the opera to satisfy my anxiety for the continuation of the rehearsals. People here had indulged in the oddest ideas and seemed to have assumed that I was as good as dead. I learned that the rehearsals had been needlessly suspended and moreover gathered from one indication after another that the affair had practically collapsed, although in my intense desire for recovery I tried my utmost to conceal this from myself. But I was much elated and pleased to see that the translation of the 4 operatic librettos which had so far appeared had been published. I had written a very exhaustive preface to them addressed to M. Frederick Villot. The translation of all this had been arranged for me by M. Chalamel Lacour, a man with whom I had become acquainted at Herwega's house in days gone by, when he was a political refugee. He was a highly intelligent translator, and had now done me such admirable service that everyone recognized the value of his work. I had given J. Weber, the bookseller in Leipzig, the German original of the preface to publish under the title of Zukunftsmusik. This pamphlet also reached me now and pleased me, as it probably represented the only result of my whole Paris undertaking, which looked so brilliant on the surface. At the same time, I was now in a position to complete the new composition for Tannhauser, of which the great dance scene in the Venusberg was still incomplete. I finished it at 3 o'clock one morning after staying up all night, just as Minna returned home from a great ball at the Hotel de Ville to which she had been with a friend. I had given her some handsome presents for Christmas, but as far as I myself was concerned I continued, on the advice of my doctor, to assist the slow process of recovery by a beefsteak in the morning and a glass of Bavarian beer before going to bed. We did not watch the old year out. On the contrary, I retired to bed and slept calmly into 1861. 1861. The slackness with which the rehearsals of Tannhauser were being conducted when I fell ill-changed at the beginning of the new year into a more decided handling of all the details connected with the intended performance. But I could not fail to notice at the same time that the attitude of all those who took part was substantially altered. The rehearsals, which were more numerous than might be expected, gave me the impression that the management was adhering to the strict execution of a command, but were not fired by any hope of successful results. Certainly I now obtained a clearer insight into the actual state of affairs. From the press, which was entirely in the hands of Meyerbeer, I knew long ago what I had to expect. The management of the opera, probably after repeated efforts to make the chief leaders in the press tractable, were now likewise convinced that my Tannhauser venture would only meet with a hostile reception from that quarter. This view was shared even in the highest circles, and it seemed as if an attempt was being made to discover some means whereby to win over to my side that part of the operatic public which could turn the scales. Prince Metternich sent me an invitation one day to meet the new cabinet minister, Count Walski. An air of ceremony pervaded the introduction and made it particularly significant when the Count, in a persuasive speech, endeavored to convince me that they entertained every wish for my good fortune and desired to help me to a brilliant success. He added in conclusion that the power to effect this was in my own hands, if I would only consent to introduce a ballet into the second act of my opera. The most celebrated ballet dancers from St. Petersburg and London had been proposed to me, and I had only to make my selection. Their engagement would be concluded as soon as I had entrusted the success of my work to their cooperation. In declining these proposals, I think I was no less eloquent than he in making them. My complete failure, however, was due to the fact that I did not appear to understand the worthy minister when he informed me that the ballet in the first act counted for nothing, because those devotees of the theater who only cared for the ballet on an opera night were accustomed, according to the new fashion, not to dine until 8 o'clock, and so did not reach the theater until 10 o'clock, when about half the performance was over. I replied that I could not undertake myself to oblige these gentlemen, but might well hope duly to impress another part of the public. But with his imperturbable air of ceremony, he met me with the objection that these gentlemen's support could alone be counted upon to produce a successful result, inasmuch as they were powerful enough even to defy the hostile attitude of the press. This precaution awakened no response in me, and I offered to withdraw my work altogether, whereupon I was assured with the greatest earnestness that, according to the Emperor's command, which had to be universally respected, I was master of the situation, and my wishes would be followed in everything. The Count had only thought it his duty to give me a friendly piece of advice. The consequences of this conversation soon became evident in many ways. I threw myself enthusiastically into the work of carrying out the great dance scenes of the first act, and tried to win Petitpas, the ballet master, to my side. I asked for unheard-of combinations quite different from those generally employed in the ballet. I drew attention to the dances of the Maenads and Bacchantes, and astounded Petitpas with the mere proposition that he would be able to accomplish something of the kind with his graceful pupils, as it was well within his powers. He explained to me that by placing my ballet at the beginning of the first act, I had myself renounced all claim to the step dancers attached to the opera, and all he could do was to offer to engage 3 Hungarian dancers, who had formerly danced in the fairy scenes at the Porte Saint Martin, to fill the parts of the 3 Graces. As I was quite content to dispense with the distinguished dancers belonging to the opera, I insisted all the more that the rank and file of the ballet should be actively coached. I wanted to know that the male staff was present in full force, but I learned that it was impossible to bring it up to my requirements, unless some tailors were engaged who, for a monthly salary of 50 francs, figured in a vague way in the wings during the performances of the solo dancers. Finally, I tried to produce my effects by means of the costumes, and asked for considerable funds for that purpose, only to learn, after I had been wearied by one subterfuge after another, that the management was determined not to expend a halfpenny on my ballet, which they regarded as completely wasted. Such was the substance of what my trusty friend Truanette conveyed to me. This was the first sign out of many which soon revealed to me the fact that even in the circles of the operatic administration itself, Tannhauser was already regarded as labor lost and sheer waste of trouble. The atmosphere created by this conviction now weighed with increasing pressure upon everything which was undertaken for the preparation of a performance which was postponed time after time. With the beginning of the year, the rehearsals had readied the stage at which the scenes were arranged, and the orchestral practices begun. Everything was conducted with a care which impressed me very agreeably at the beginning, until finally I was bored by it, because I saw that the powers of the performers were being relaxed by eternal repetition, and it was now evident that I must trust to my own ability to pull the matter quickly through as I thought best. But it was not the fatigue due to this system that finally made Niemann, the main prop in my work, recoil from the task which at the start he had undertaken with an energy full of promise. He had been informed that there was a conspiracy to ruin my work. From this time forward, he was a victim to a despondency to which, in his relations with me, he sought to lend a sort of diabolical character. He maintained that so far he could only see the matter in a black light, and he brought forward some arguments that sounded very sensible. He criticized the whole opera as an institution and the public attached to it, and also our staff of singers, of whom he maintained that not a single one understood his part as I intended it, and he exposed all the disadvantages of the undertaking, which I myself could not fail to see as soon as I came to deal with the chef du chant, the régisseur, the ballet master, the conductor of the chorus, but particularly with the chef d'orchestre. Above all, Niemann, who at the beginning, with a full knowledge of what it involved, had imposed upon himself the task of playing his part without curtailments of any sort, insisted upon cutting down the score. He met my expression of astonishment with the remark that I must not suppose that the sacrifice of this or that passage mattered, but that we were in the throes of an undertaking which could not be got through too quickly. Under circumstances from which so little encouragement could be derived, the study of Tannhauser dragged itself along to the brink of the so-called dress rehearsals. From all sides the friends of my past life gathered together in Paris to be present at the apotheosis of the first performance. Among these were Otto Wesendonck, Ferdinand Prager, the unfortunate Keats, for whom I had to pay the costs of his journey and of his stay in Paris. Luckily, M. Chandon from Epinay came, too, with a hamper of Fleur du Jardin, the finest of all his champagne brands. This was to be drunk to the success of Tannhauser. Bülow also came, depressed and saddened by the burdens of his own life, and hoping to be able to gather courage and renewed vitality from the success of my undertaking. I did not dare to tell him in so many words of the miserable state of affairs. On the contrary, seeing him so depressed, I made the best of a bad matter. At the first rehearsal, however, at which Bülow was present, he did not fail to grasp how matters stood. I no longer concealed anything from him, and we continued to indulge in sorrowful intercourse till the night of the performance, which was again and again postponed, and it was only his untiring efforts to be of use to me that gave some life to our companionship. From whatever side we regarded our grotesque undertaking, we encountered unsuitability and incompetence. For instance, it was impossible in the whole of Paris to find the 12 French horns which in Dresden had so bravely sounded the hunting call in the first act. In connection with this matter, I had to deal with the terrible Mansax, the celebrated instrument maker. He had to help me out with all kinds of substitutes in the shape of saxophones and sax horns. Moreover, he was officially appointed to conduct the music behind the scenes. It was an impossibility ever to get this music properly played. The main grievance, however, lay in the incompetence of M. Dietzke, the conductor, which had now reached a pitch hitherto unsuspected. In the numerous orchestral rehearsals which had been held hitherto, I had accustomed myself to use this man like a machine. From my habitual position on the stage near his desk, I had conducted both conductor and orchestra. In this way I had maintained my tempi in such a way that I felt no doubt that on my removal all my points would remain firmly established. I found, on the contrary, that no sooner was Dietzke left to his own resources than everything began to waver. Not one tempo, not one nuance was conscientiously and strictly preserved. I then realized the extreme danger in which we were placed. Granted that no one singer was suited to his task, or qualified to achieve it so as to produce a genuine effect. Granted that the ballet, and even the sumptuous mounting and vitality of the Parisian performances of the day, could contribute nothing on this occasion, or at most but little. Granted that the whole spirit of the libretto, and that indefinable something which, even in the worst performances of Tannhäuser in Germany, roused a feeling of home, was likely here to strike an alien or at best an unfamiliar note. Yet in spite of all this the character of the orchestral music, which if rendered with emphasis was full of suggestive expression, led one to hope that it would make an impression even upon a Parisian audience. But it was precisely in this particular that I saw everything submerged in a colorless chaos, with every line of the drawing obliterated. Moreover, the singers became more and more uncertain in their work. Even the poor ballet girls were no longer able to keep time in their trivial steps, so that at last I thought myself obliged to interpose with the declaration that the opera required a different conductor, and that in case of necessity I myself was ready to take his place. This declaration brought to a climax the confusion that had grown up around me. Even the members of the orchestra, who had long recognized and openly ridiculed their conductor's incompetence, took sides against me now that the matter concerned their notorious chief. The press lashed itself into fury over my arrogance, and in the face of all the agitation caused by the affair, Napoleon III could send me no better advice than to forego my requests, as in adhering to them I should only be exposing the chances of my work to the greatest risks. On the other hand, I was allowed to start fresh rehearsals and have them repeated until I was satisfied. This way out of the difficulty could lead to nothing but an increase of fatigue for me and for the whole staff actively engaged in the undertaking, and the fact still remained that diets could not be depended upon for the tempo. Finally, by sheer force of will rather than of conviction, I tried to imagine I was doing a service by holding out for the correct interpretation of a performance which, after all, had to be got through, whereupon for the first time the impetuous musicians broke out into rebellion against the excessive rehearsals. At this stage I noticed that the guarantee of my practical control given by the general management was not altogether made in good faith, and in the face of the growing complaint on all sides against being over-fatigued I decided to demand the return of my score, as they called it, that is to say, to dispense with the production of the opera. I addressed an express request to this effect to the cabinet minister Walewski, but received the answer that it was impossible to comply with my wishes, more particularly on account of the heavy expenses which had already been incurred in its preparation. I refused to abide by his decision, and called a conference of those friends of mine who were more closely interested in me, among whom were Count Hatzfeld and Emil Erlanger. I took counsel with them as to the means at my disposal for forbidding Tannhäuser to be performed at the Opera House. It happened that Otto Wesendonck was present at this conference. He was still waiting in Paris, hoping to have the pleasure of attending the first performance, but he was now thoroughly convinced that the situation was hopeless, and promptly fled back to Zurich. Prager had already done likewise. Keats alone held out faithfully, and he busied himself in trying to make some money in Paris to provide for his future, in which attempt he was hampered by many difficulties that stood in the way of his desire. This conference resulted in fresh representations being made to the Emperor Napoleon, which, however, met with the same gracious reply as before, and I was authorized to institute a fresh course of rehearsals. At last, weary to the depths of my soul, completely disillusioned, and absolutely decided in my pessimistic view of the matter, I determined to abandon it to its fate. Having at last, in this frame of mind, given my consent to fix the date of the first performance of my opera, I was now plagued in another direction in the most astonishing way. Every one of my friends and partisans demanded a good seat for the first night, but the management pointed out that the occupation of the house on such occasions was entirely in the hands of the court and those dependent on it, and I was soon to realize clearly enough to whom these seats were to be allotted. At present I had to suffer the annoyance of being unable to serve many of my friends as I should have liked. Some of them were very quick to resent what they supposed to be my neglect of them. Champ Fleury, in a letter, complained of this flagrant breach of friendship. Gasparini started an open quarrel because I had not reserved one of the best boxes for his patron and my creditor Lucy, the receiver general of Marseilles. Even Blondine, who had been filled with the most generous enthusiasm for my work at the rehearsals she had attended, could not suppress a suspicion that I was guilty of neglecting my best friends when I was unable to offer her and her husband Olivier anything better than a couple of stalls. It needed all Emile's sang-froid to obtain from this deeply offended friend a just appreciation of the honest assurance that I was in an impossible position in which I was exposed to betrayal on all sides. Poor Bülow alone understood everything. He suffered with me, and shirked no trouble to be of use to me in all these difficulties. The first performance on the 13th of March put an end to all these complications. My friends now understood that it was to no celebration of my triumphs, as they supposed, to which they should have been invited. I have already said enough elsewhere of the way in which this evening passed off. I was justified in flattering myself that in the end a favorable view of my opera prevailed, inasmuch as the intention of my opponents had been to break up this performance completely, and this they had found it impossible to do. But I was grieved the next day to receive nothing but reproaches from my friends, with Gasparini at the head of them, because I had allowed the occupation of the house at the first performance to be completely wrested out of my hands. Meyerbeer, they urged, knew how to work such things differently, had he not, ever since he first appeared in Paris, refused to allow the production of a single one of his operas to take place without a guarantee that he himself should fill the auditorium to the remotest corner? As I had not looked after my best friends, such as Lucy, was not the ill success of that evening to be ascribed to my own conduct? Confronted with these and similar arguments, I had to spend the whole day in writing letters and in devoting myself to the most urgent efforts at propitiation. Above all, I was besieged with advice as to how I might recover the lost ground at the subsequent performances. As the management placed a very small number of free seats at my disposal, money had to be found for the purchase of tickets. In the pursuit of this object, which my friends were so warmly advocating and which involved much that was disagreeable, I shrank from approaching Emile Erlanger or anybody else. Giacomelli, however, had found out that Offmort, the merchant, a business friend of Wesendonck, had offered to help to the extent of 500 francs. I now allowed these champions of my welfare to act according to their own ideas, and was curious to see what assistance I should derive from these resources which I had previously neglected and now utilized. The second performance took place on the 18th of March, and, indeed, the first act promised well. The overture was loudly applauded without a note of opposition. Madame Tedesco, who had eventually been completely won over to her part of Venus by a wig powdered with gold dust, called out triumphantly to me in the manager's box, when the septuor of the finale of the first act was again vigorously applauded, that everything was now all right and that we had won the victory. But when shrill whistling was suddenly heard in the second act, Royer the manager turned to me with an air of complete resignation and said, "Ce sont les jockeys. Nous sommes perdus." Apparently, at the bidding of the emperor, extensive negotiations had been entered into with these members of the Jockey Club as to the fate of my opera. They had been requested to allow 3 performances to take place, after which they had been promised that it should be so curtailed as to admit of its presentation only as a curtain raiser to introduce a ballet which was to follow. But these gentlemen had not agreed to the terms. In the first place, my attitude during the first performance, which had been such a bone of contention, had been observed to be utterly unlike that of a man who would consent to the proposed line of conduct. This being so, it was to be feared that if 2 more performances were allowed to take place without interruption, we might hope to win so many adherents that the friends of the ballet would be treated to repetitions of this work 30 times running. To guard against this, they determined to protest in time. The fact that these gentlemen meant business was now realized by the excellent M. Royer, and from that time he gave up all attempt to resist them, in spite of the support granted to our party by the emperor and his consort, who stoically kept their seats through the uproars of their own courtiers. The impression made by this scene had a disastrous effect upon my friends. After the performance, Bülow broke out into sobs as he embraced Minna, who had not been spared the insults of those next to her when they recognized her as the wife of the composer. Our trusty servant Therese, a Swabian girl, had been sneered at by a crazy hooligan, but when she realized that he understood German, she succeeded in quieting him for a time by calling him Schweinhund at the top of her voice. Poor Keats was struck dumb with disappointment, and Chandon's Fleur du Jardin was growing sour in the storeroom. Hearing that in spite of everything a 3rd performance was fixed, I was confronted with only 2 possible solutions of the difficulty. One was to try once more to withdraw my score, the other, to demand that my opera should be given on a Sunday, that is to say, on a non-subscriber's day. I assumed that such a performance could not be regarded by the usual ticket holders as a provocation, for they were quite accustomed on such days to surrender their boxes to any of the general public who chanced to come and buy them. My strategical proposal seemed to please the management and the Tilleries, and was accepted. Only they refused to conform to my wish to announce this as the 3rd and last performance. Both Minna and I stayed away from this, as it was just as embarrassing for me to know that my wife was insulted as to see the singers on the stage subjected to such behavior. I was really sorry for Morelli and Emily Sachs, who had proved their genuine devotion to me. As soon as the first performance was over, I met Emily Sachs in the corridor on her way home, and chaffed her about being whistled off the stage. «With pro dignity s'y replier, je le supporterai 100 fois comme aujourd'hui.» Ah, les miserables! Morelli found himself strangely perplexed when he had to weather the onslaught of the hooligans. I had explained to him in the minutest detail how to act his part from the time when Elizabeth disappears in the third act until the beginning of his song to the evening star. He was not to move an inch from his rocky ledge, and from this position, half turning to the audience, he was to address his farewell to the departing lady. It had been a difficult task for him to obey my instructions, as he maintained that it was against all operatic custom for the singer not to address such an important passage straight to the public from the footlights. When in the course of the performance he seized his harp to begin the song, there was a cry from the audience, "Ah! Il prend encore assez harp," upon which there was a universal outburst of laughter followed by fresh whistling, so prolonged that at last Morelli decided boldly to lay aside his harp and step forward to the proscenium in the usual way. Here he resolutely sang his evening carol entirely unaccompanied, as Dietz only found his place at the 10th bar. Peace was then restored, and at last the public listened breathlessly to the song, and at its close covered the singer with applause. As the vocalists showed a courageous determination to encounter fresh onslaughts, I could not protest. At the same time, I could not endure to be in the position of a passive spectator suffering at the infliction of such unworthy methods, and as the third performance was also likely to be attended with doubtful consequences, I stayed at home. After the various acts, messages reached us informing us that after the first act Troinet at once came round to my opinion that the score should be withdrawn. It was found that the jockeys had not stayed away, as was their custom, from this Sunday performance. On the contrary, they had purposely taken their seats from the beginning, so as not to allow a single scene to pass without a row. I was assured that in the first act the performance had been twice suspended by fights lasting a quarter of an hour each. By far the greater part of the public obstinately took my part against the childish conduct of the rowdies, without intending by their action to express any opinion of my work. But in opposing their assailants, they were at a great disadvantage. When everybody on my side was utterly wearied out with clapping and shouting applause and calling order, and it looked as if peace were about to reign once more, the jockeys returned afresh to their task and began cheerfully whistling their hunting tunes and playing their flageolets, so that they were always bound to have the last word. In an interval between the acts, one of these gentlemen entered the box of a certain great lady, who in the excess of her anger introduced him to one of her friends with the words, "C'est un de ces miserables, mon cousin." The young man, completely unabashed, answered, "Que voulez-vous?" I am beginning to like the music myself. But, you see, a man must keep his word. If you will excuse me, I will return to my work again. He thereupon took his leave. The next day I met Johann Seebach, the friendly Saxon ambassador, who was as hoarse as he could be, as he and all his friends had completely lost their voices through the uproar of the previous night. Princess Metternich had remained at home, as she had already had to endure the coarse insults and ridicule of our opponents at the first two performances. She indicated the height to which this fury had risen by mentioning some of her best friends, with whom she had engaged in so virulent a controversy that she had ended by saying, "Away with your free France." In Vienna, where at least there is a genuine aristocracy, it would be unthinkable for a Prince Liechtenstein or Schwarzenberg to scream from his box for a ballet in Fidelio. I believe she also spoke to the emperor in the same strain, so that he seriously debated whether by police intervention some check could not be put upon the unmannerly conduct of these gentlemen, most of whom, unfortunately, belonged to the imperial household. Some rumor of this got abroad, so that my friends believed they had really gained the day when, at the third performance, they found the corridors of the theater occupied by a strong body of police. But it turned out later on that these precautions had only been taken to ensure the safety of the jockeys, as it was feared they might be attacked from the pit as a punishment for their insolence. It seems that the performance, which was again carried through to the end, was accompanied from start to finish by an endless tumult. After the second act, the wife of von Semir, the Hungarian revolutionary minister, joined us in a state of complete collapse, declaring that the row in the theater was more than she could bear. No one seemed able to tell me exactly how the third act had been got through. As far as I could make out, it resembled the turmoil of a battle thick with the smoke of gunpowder. I invited my friend Tronet to visit me the next morning, so that with his help I might compose a letter to the management withdrawing my work and, as author, forbidding any further performance of the same, as I did not wish to see my singers abused instead of myself by a section of the public from whom the imperial administration seemed unable to protect them. The astonishing thing about the whole matter was that in thus interfering I was guilty of no bravado, for a fourth and fifth performance of the opera had been already arranged, and the management protested that they were under obligations to the public, who still continued to crowd to this opera. But through Tronet I contrived to have my letter published the next day in the Journal de Débats, so that at last, though with great reluctance, the management gave their consent to my withdrawal of the piece. Thereupon the legal action taken on my behalf by Olivier against Lindau also came to an end. The latter had put in a claim on my author's rights in the libretto, in which he said he was entitled to a share as one of the 3 collaborators. His counsel, Maître Marie, based his plea on a principle which I was said to have established myself, namely that the point of chief importance was not the melody, but the correct declamation of the words of the libretto, which obviously neither Roche nor Tronet could have ensured, seeing that neither of them understood German. Olivier's argument for the defense was so energetic that he was almost on the point of proving the purely musical essence of my melody by singing the Abendstern. Completely carried away by this, the judges rejected the plaintiff's claim, but requested me to pay him a small sum by way of compensation, as he seemed really to have taken some part in the work at the beginning. In any case, however, I could not have paid this out of the proceeds of the Paris performances of Tannhäuser, as I had decided with Truinet on withdrawing the opera to hand over the whole of the proceeds from my author's rights, both for libretto and music, to poor Roche, to whom the failure of my work meant the ruin of all his hopes for the amelioration of his position. Various other connections were also dissolved by this outcome of affairs. During the past few months, I had busied myself with an artistic club which had been founded, chiefly through the influence of the German embassies, among an aristocratic connection for the production of good music apart from the theaters, and to stimulate interest in this branch of art among the upper classes. Unfortunately, in the circular it had published, it had illustrated its endeavors to produce good music by comparing them to those of the Jockey Club to improve the breed of horses. Their object was to enroll all who had won a name in the musical world, and I was obliged to become a member at a yearly subscription of 200 francs. Together with M. Gounod and other Parisian celebrities, I was nominated one of an artistic committee, of which Aubert was elected president. The society often held its meetings at the house of a certain Count Osmond, a lively young man who had lost an arm in a duel and posed as a musical dilettante. In this way, I also learned to know a young Prince Polignac, who interested me particularly on account of his brother, to whom we were indebted for a complete translation of Faust. I went to lunch with him one morning, when he revealed to me the fact that he composed musical fantasies. He was very anxious to convince me of the correctness of his interpretation of Beethoven's Symphony in A major, in the last movement of which he declared he could clearly demonstrate all the phases of a shipwreck. Our earlier general meetings were chiefly occupied with arrangements and preparations for a great classical concert, for which I also was to compose something. These meetings were enlivened solely by Gounod's pedantic zeal, who with unflagging and nauseating garrulity executed his duties as secretary, while Aubert continually interrupted, rather than assisted the proceedings, with trifling and not always very delicate anecdotes and puns, all evidently intended to urge us to end the discussions. Even after the decisive failure of Tannhauser, I received summonses to the meetings of this committee, but never attended it any more, and sent in my resignation to the president of the society, stating that I should probably soon be returning to Germany. With Gounod alone did I still continue on friendly terms, and I heard that he energetically championed my cause in society. He is said on one occasion to have exclaimed, "Que Dieu me donne un parachute." As an acknowledgment of this advocacy, I presented him with the score of Tristan und Isolde, being all the more gratified by his behavior because no feeling of friendship had ever been able to induce me to hear his Faust. I now came into touch with energetic protagonists of my cause at every turn. I was particularly honored in the columns of those smaller journals of which Meyerbeer had as yet taken no account, and several good criticisms now appeared. In one of these I read that my Tannhauser was La Symphonie Chanty. Baudelaire distinguished himself, by an exceedingly witty and aptly turned pamphlet on this topic, and finally Jules Janin himself astonished me by an article in the Journal de Débats, in which, with burning indignation, he gave a somewhat exaggerated report, in his own peculiar style, of the whole episode. Even parodies of Tannhauser were given in the theaters for the delectation of the public, and Musard could find no better means of attracting audiences to his concerts than the daily announcement, in enormous letters, of the overture to Tannhauser. Pastelub also frequently produced some of my pieces, by way of showing his sentiments. And lastly, Countess Lowenthal, the wife of the Austrian military plenipotentiary, gave a great matinee, at which Madame Viardot sang various items from Tannhauser, for which she received 500 francs. By some singular coincidence, people managed to confound my fate with that of a certain M. de la Vacquerie, who had also made a dismal failure with a drama, Les Funérailles d'Eleanor. His friends gave a banquet, to which I was invited, and we were both enthusiastically acclaimed. Fiery speeches were made about the encanalement of the public, containing references to politics, which were easily explained by the fact that my partner in the festivity was related to Victor Hugo. Unfortunately, particular supporters had provided a small piano, on which I was literally compelled to play favorite passages from Tannhauser. Whereupon the evening became a festival in my honor alone. But a much more important result than these was that people began to recognize the reality of my popularity and began to plan yet greater undertakings. The manager of the Theatre Lyrique sought everywhere for a tenor suitable for Tannhauser, and only his inability to find one compelled him to renounce his intention of producing my opera at once. M. de Beaumont, the manager of the Opera Comique, who was on the verge of bankruptcy, hoped to save himself with Tannhauser, with which intention he approached me with the most urgent proposals. True, he hoped at the same time to enlist Princess Metternich's intervention on his behalf with the Emperor, who was to help him out of his embarrassments. He reproached me with coldness when I failed to fall in with his glowing dreams, in which I could find no pleasure. But I was interested to learn that Roger, who now had a post at the Opera Comique, had included part of the last act of Tannhauser in the program of a performance given for his own benefit, whereby he drew down upon his head the fury of the more influential press, but won a good reception from the public. Schemes now began to multiply. A. M. Chabrol, whose journalistic name was Lorbach, visited me on behalf of a company whose director was an enormously wealthy man, with a plan for founding a Theater Wagner, of which I refused to hear anything until it could secure an experienced man of first-class reputation as manager. Eventually M. Perrin was selected for the post. This man had lived for years in the firm conviction that he would be someday appointed manager of the Grand Opera, and thought, therefore, that he ought not to compromise himself. It is true, he ascribed the failure of Tannhauser entirely to Royer's incapacity, who ought to have made it his business to win over the press to his side. Nevertheless, he was strongly tempted to share in the attempt because of the opportunity it afforded him of proving that, if he took the matter in hand, everything would at once wear a different aspect and Tannhauser become a great success. But as he was an exceedingly cold and cautious man, he thought he had discovered serious flaws in Lorbacca's proposals, and when the latter began to stipulate for certain commissions, Perrin immediately fancied that he detected a not quite blameless savor of speculation in the whole business, and declared that if he wanted to found a Wagner theater, he would manage to procure the necessary funds in his own way. As a matter of fact, he did actually entertain the notion of securing a large café, the Alcazar, and after that the Bazar de la Bonne Nouvelle, for the purposes of such a theater. It also seemed possible that the requisite capitalists would be found for his enterprise. Erlanger believed he could succeed in getting 10 bankers to guarantee 50,000 francs, thus placing a sum of 500,000 francs at Perrin's disposal. But the latter soon lost courage when he found that the gentlemen thus approached were willing to risk their money on a theater for their own amusement, but not for the serious purpose of acclimatizing my music in Paris. With this disappointing experience, Erlanger now withdrew from all further participation in my fate. From a business point of view, he regarded the arrangement made with me as a sort of deal, in which he had not succeeded. The settlement of my financial position seemed likely now to be undertaken by other friends, and with this object in view the German embassies approached me with great delicacy, commissioning Count Hatzfeld to inquire into my necessities. My own view of the situation was simply that, in obedience to the Emperor's command for the production of my opera, I had wasted my time over an enterprise the failure of which had not been my fault. With perfect justice, my friends pointed out how careless I had been not to secure from the first certain stipulations about compensations, a demand which the Frenchman's practical mind would at once have recognized as reasonable and obvious. As matters stood, I had demanded no return for my time and labor beyond certain authors' rights in case of success. Feeling how impossible it was for me to approach either the management or the Emperor to retrieve this omission, I was content to leave Princess Metternich to intercede on my behalf. Count Portalas had stayed on in Berlin to try and persuade the Prince Regent to order a performance of Tannhauser for my benefit. Unfortunately, the latter had been unable to secure the execution of his order owing to the opposition of his manager, Herr von Hulsen, who was hostile to me. As I had no other prospect for a long time to come but one of complete helplessness, I had no option but to leave the representation of my claim for compensation to the kindly care of my royal patroness. All these events had taken place within the short space of a month after the production of Tannhauser, and now, on the April 15th, I went for a short trip to Germany to try and find some solid ground for my future in that country.